Greetings. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this presentation that I'm sharing with you today, entitled Understanding and Working with African American Families and Culture, Perspectives and Considerations from Academia, Lived and Professional Experiences. My name is Richard Coleman, and I'll do a more formal introduction as we move forward. So some things to consider before we start today. Information that I'll be sharing with you will be the result of my own perspectives in terms of work that I have done in the field, my own personal experiences, research, as well as historical data. And also just to recognize that culture is fluid and it changes. So not everything that I say as it relates to will apply for all African American people. So just keep that particular piece in mind as well. And then I would also ask you just to simply be open to the dialogue that we're about to engage in. So, what are our objectives for today? So, they're listed here in these 6 bullets. So, in the conversation today, we're going to talk about some of the basic aspects of African American culture, and you will hear me use African American and Black interchangeably throughout the presentation today. We're going to talk about the impact of systemic racism on Black families, understanding the role and definition of family systems, engaging and assessing family functioning. We'll spend some time talking about those things as well as acknowledging and reconciling worker as well as agency bias. And then we'll finish up with some cultural practice considerations when you're working with African American families in the child welfare system. So that's the journey today. All right, so before we get started, I wanted to do this particular piece as well. As you can see here, um, these are my observations, opinions, and this is a result of academic research that I have done. And these views may or may not reflect the Department of Children, Youth, and Family Services for the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Child Welfare Training Academy, and or the Multidisciplinary Institute of Child Welfare. And also just to kind of prepare you that this presentation will probably be about 40 minutes in length. So I just wanted to give you that warning before we moved into things that got started. So my association with the work. So in the days of me being an assistant professor, um, I always had my students do research. We worked at a small liberal arts college that was a private Catholic college, and it was very heavily research focused and research driven. And so when I would have my students actually do research for some of their classroom assignments, one of the things that I always felt like was very important was for them to create an annotated bibliography. So in other words, the people who you are using information, the sources of information, how are they actually associated with the work? Because that's important in terms of credibility as we move forward. So in that same vein, I wanted to take a few minutes before we got into the meat of the presentation about how I'm associated with the work. So as you can see here on the screen, I've been in social work for about 43 years in human services in some form or capacity, one or another. Educated at Historically Black College, Mississippi Valley State University, and have my MSW with a special emphasis in child welfare from the University of Minnesota. So I've been a social worker again, as I said earlier, for about 43 years, and I spent 11 years as an assistant professor in liberal arts program, social work program as well. So these are a little bit of things about me that actually lends to why some of the things that I may be sharing with y'all today you may find important. As we move further, these are other things that I have done in the course of the 43 years that really kind of um, tie in the work or the things that I'm about to present to you as it relates to African American culture. So the interesting piece is that all of these particular positions that I've had over career all have a unique intersection with child welfare in terms of some of the clientele and the populations that I've had the opportunity to work with. So just wanted to get the preliminaries out of the way, and now let's get into the meat of the presentation. So we're going to spend a little bit of time um, talking about African American culture. We're going to do a brief overview of what those particular cultural and community dynamics look like. Um, so it won't be an exhaustive piece, but just enough for you to get a sense of where we're going to go on this particular conversation today. So let's go back to, let's say, the early 1920s. And so we had a wonderful young man by the name of Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican political activist, and he was a black nationalist. So he started the organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And so he did something very important. So, given the history of how many of our brothers and sisters, African American, got to this continent, it was through the transatlantic slave trade. So, as a part of that particular process, we were stripped of our nationhood and we were stripped of any symbolism of what it meant to be African. And so Marcus, in his infinite wisdom, and the members of his organization developed this particular flag. And it's an effort really to deem to be essential in terms of the lack of symbolism of nationhood, especially for African Americans in the United States. And so he came up with this particular wonderful concept. So many of you may have actually seen this flag at some particular point in time. Well, let's talk about that particular flag. So the colors of the flag are red, black, and green. So the red symbolizes the color, the blood shed for the redemption of our liberty. The black represents the color of the distinguished race to which we belong. And the green is representative of the vegetation from our motherland. And it's no coincidence that the actual color scheme that we're utilizing in this presentation happens to be red, black, and green. So let's talk a little about African American culture. So some things that I want you all to take away and to really kind of understand as it relates to African American culture is that it's not just about ethnicity or race. They are components, but they don't add up to the sum total of what we're talking about when we talk about African American culture. It's a culture that reflects a shared history, values, and beliefs, and it's systems that influence how Black people function. Um, there are some important attributes that we're going to spend some time talking about as it relates to African American culture. And we're going to talk about this concept of home culture. So I'll go in depth in the next few slides, really kind of bringing that whole piece to light. But basically, when we're talking about home culture in the African American community, we're talking about value systems, immediate family and extended family, and the concepts of interdependence and bicultural socialization. So we'll spend some time there, again, as I said, in the next couple of slides. Now, that is juxtaposed to societal culture. And societal culture is primarily white dominated in terms of its ideology and how it actually is manifested. And so when we think about group values in some of these larger systems that we all interface with, educational systems, criminal justice systems, political and religious and financial systems, we're really looking at it through the lens of what we deem as societal culture. That's been, again, largely influenced, directed, and created by white bodied individuals. The other thing we need to have you understand as well, too, is being Black is not a color, it is an experience. And so when we think about this experience that we're having and that we will go into in greater detail, we need to also recognize that 10 to 30% of the Black population in the United States are not direct descendants of American chattel slavery. So oftentimes there's this whole idea that the Black community is a monolith and we're actually much more diverse than that in terms of not a one size fits all. So basically, what we were looking at is we had immigrants who came to this country who were from Africa and the Caribbean, but also recognizing that 90% of African Americans who live in this country now do have roots in slavery. And the remaining 10% were first generation immigrants that were directly connected to this history of slavery that we experienced. So, again, blacks, people, African American folks are not a monolith. We exist in literally every sphere of socioeconomic and political stance in this particular country. So, from the single parent household all the way up to billionaire status with leaving legacies is what encompasses the black community. So now, this presentation is really geared towards folks who are working with African American families. So case managers, social workers, intake assessors was really where we want to kind of drive pieces home to make sure that there's a clear understanding around what our culture actually entails. And I'll share some personal pieces myself about what that might look like as well. But we also need to, again, recognize this whole piece around societal culture, right? So again, as I had talked about in the previous slide, that these are white dominated systems that have been created that run all of our country. And the other reality is that the ideological principles that uh, pretty much support this particular societal culture are steeped in colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And for those particular systems to continue to exist and flourish, there has to be certain members or certain parts of our society who are actually oppressed to make sure that this reality stays real for those who are in power. So just want to touch on that particular piece in terms of really kind of digging into it. So when we think about the other attributes of African American culture, there's this whole notion of interdependence, which means that you're a part of a larger system and we are all depend on each other for the well-being. There's also the concept and the notion that there's a reciprocal obligation that comes from not forgetting where you came from and how we are able to balance that independence and that interdependence. So, Richard, what are you talking about when you talk about interdependence? Uh, let's talk about this home culture piece. And so, as an aspect of home culture for African Americans, this interdependence piece is really crucial to our existence in many instances. So, I'll share some things with you to give you a sense of what that might look like. So, I grew up in the Mississippi Delta in the 1960s, right? My first address that I remember was 319 North Eureka. That was the street that we lived on in Greenville, Mississippi. Greenville, Mississippi sits on the river about 150 miles south of Memphis. It is a predominantly African American town of about 50, 60,000 people. And when I think about growing up on North Eureka, there was probably a 6 to 8 block radius around our home where everybody knew each other, where kids were able to go into the neighborhood and be gone all day playing, having a wonderful time, but also recognizing that the community was holding them responsible for their behavior while they were out, and someone was watching to make sure that we were always kept safe as a part of this whole interdependence piece. So there was that how the community kind of connected in and was an asset and a resource for each other. I also grew up in a multi-generational home. I had a great aunt who was the primary caretaker for myself and my other 5 siblings. While I did have a mom and dad who lived in the home who worked, the primary responsibility for raising children actually fell to my aunt. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic in terms of how that particular process worked. Having a large extended family, there were tons of great nieces, or should I say, great aunts and uncles, probably 9 or so, that were connected to my grandmother. My aunt, who lived with us, also raised my mom, as my grandma was a teen parent and not capable of actually raising my mother. So again, when you start to look at that whole piece around interdependence, you can start to see these concepts around relationships in larger systems and how they actually end up working with each other. So again, in our neighborhood, for example, a way that independent or interdependence showed up. There were friends of mine who lived across the street. In particular, I had a friend who we graduated high school together, and we've been best buds ever since then. But his mom and his dad were separated, and on occasion, dad would come out on the weekend. They would drink too much. There would be all kinds of issues going on. Sometimes the police were called. No one ever went to jail. But as a response to that, in terms of what the community did, is that my friends then would come to our house and they would spend the night while the families worked through the difficulties that they were actually having. I also have another set of brothers who are not blood related to me, but were in our home every single solitary day as their mom was widowed and my dad acted as a parental figure for those particular boys. They didn't have a TV, but they came to our house and watched TV. So as you can see, there's this whole community of interdependence that happens. So within our neighborhoods, within our families, um, and also in our larger community, there was a fairly significant population of Chinese who lived in the black community, who owned grocery stores in the black community. I went to school with children who were actually Chinese. Um, because of the way systems were set up in those particular times, Chinese folks were not allowed to live in the neighborhood with white folks, so they had to live in community with black folks. We also had a relationship with the Jewish community who owned a good portion of the businesses in the downtown area, and they worked diligently with African Americans um, with things like credit, purchasing services, things of that particular nature. So when I talk about interdependence, I'm talking about all of those different things, right? And so that's how I grew up in terms of that. Never saw the inside of a daycare as a kid because it was always handled by family. Also recognizing that there were great aunts and uncles who adopted individual kids out of my family of six who helped with school supplies, who helped with school clothes, things of that nature. So again, this whole notion of interdependence was what I was raised with and born into. And for a for a large part, those kind of institutions still exist today, but they look a little bit different. I'll talk about that in a minute. When we talk about reciprocal obligation, it's around understanding that um, you owe the community from which you came, and so giving back to the community was just kind of a regular piece. We still do this to this particular day, to the form of book drives and different scholarship programs that we participate in, so that people from our Greenville African American community can actually go into school. And then also being able to balance that whole piece around being independent as a human being, but also valuing interdependence. So that's a little bit about African American culture and life, at least when I grew up. And I'll talk a little bit more about what it might look like as we move forward to today. So when I think about this home culture, this whole concept of home culture, and I think about being here in Minnesota for the last 38 years, we've been able to recreate the home culture piece that I grew up with in a different way. So my neighborhood is predominantly white. I have four really good neighbors who I connect with, and we constitute a community. We are involved in each other's lives in meaningful ways, and have been. Um, and continue to be. When people are not doing well, when they need assistance, we are there as neighbors. We watched children grow up uh, across the street from us and how they were connected with us as we sent them off to college. So those are the kind of things that we do. And then when I think about present day, I'm a part of a large church community. It's predominantly African American. So every Sunday I get to hang out with anywhere from 800 to 1,000 people who look like me, most of whom come from the South. And we have this family atmosphere that really kind of replicates what happened for me in the city of Greenville in terms of being there for support, um, for prayer, for lifting up, for encouraging. I'm taking care of kids in our nursery program at our church who were kids that I actually trained and taught Sunday school to as a younger adult 30 years ago. So that whole process around interdependence and home culture continues to still be a viable part of the African American community. So for those of you who are working with African American families, this is vital information for you to know and for you to understand as you do your work with them. Other thing we want to switch gears to at this point and talk about is the development of African American culture. And so you have to understand and recognize that all of these bullet points that are here on the screen is the lived reality for largely every African American family that you would encounter. At some level, at some point, and at some time, this has been the law of the land in terms of racial oppression, discrimination, deprivation of rights, no right to self-determination, those kind of things. We need to understand that that's part of what helped shape home culture for African Americans because we were largely shut out of societal cultural pieces as well too. So just to recognize those things in terms of that, and home culture exists, and it's deliberately because we were deliberately excluded from those other systems. And it's a sense of African American pride and innovation, creativity, and sustainability in terms of that. But these factors here also played a crucial role in terms of the development of what happens in African American cultural life. So we could belabor the point, but I decided that I would just kind of look at two different nuggets to really kind of introduce this piece around the history of oppression and how it has impacted the socialization process for African American families. So as you can see here on the screen, there are two bullets that talk about the constitutional amendment, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, right? But we also recognize that as a result of that, where there were tons of laws and policies that were put in place by white society that allowed discrimination to happen and continue to happen and deny opportunities for black people to kind of survive and thrive. So even after emancipation, we had black codes, we had Jim Crow laws that continued to restrict the freedoms and opportunities for many black Americans. I'll give you an example of what a Jim Crow law looks like in my hometown. My grandmother shared the story with me of a fairly well-to-do African American man who owned a mortuary. And so, again, things being segregated, um, that was an essential need for our particular community. And so, this particular person purchased a brand new Cadillac, and he also had his first business, and he used it primarily for business in terms of being a mortician. He was visited by the White Citizens Council in Greenville, and he was told that you have a really nice car, and your car is nicer than many white people who live in this particular town. So you will only be allowed to drive your car on the weekends and when you're actually conducting funeral services. So that's just an example of the oppression and what black codes and what Jim Crow laws look like that I'm familiar with even to this day. So I wanted to fast forward and look at current federal policies, executive orders, and judicial rulings that adversely impact African American families. So as you can see here on the screen, um, we've had a tax on the Voting Rights Act. We also have a series of executive orders that continue to alienate and target African American families, businesses, and institutions. And we also have our very own Department of Justice who roll back the standards in terms of the enforcement as it relates to discrimination, housing, and lending and employment. So again, those are things that inadvertently have an adverse impact on those of us who are African American. So what does this all result in? It results in this. So the impact of this systemic oppression and racism that African Americans experience results in the following. We've got what 27% poverty rates. So a little more than 1 in 4 people of African American descent live in poverty. While we make up 17% of the population, we also have this phenomenon where 41% of the single female parent households or single parent households. We have a 9.4% unemployment rate. There's a 5 times greater likelihood that we'll be imprisoned, and a 43% home ownership, and a life expectancy that's 10 years shorter than those of our white counterparts. So again, when we think about systems of oppression and how they are manifested and how they show up, they have a profound impact on African American culture and African American well-being. So I'm going to switch gears now and go into some of the research pieces around gentleman's practice. And so, as you know, trained social workers, these are the steps that we go through when we interface with families, right? We have to do the engagement, we have to be able to do the assessment, which is ongoing. We plan in conjunction with those families, we put a plan in place, we implement it, we evaluate the effectiveness of it, and once we see sufficient behavioral change where kids can safely be maintained in the home, we terminate services. So that's kind of the pieces that we wanted to just kind of reiterate in terms of that. So when we think about the family, here's some things that we need to actually be mindful of. Everybody comes from a family, right? They all look different. There are an infinite number of ways that families structure themselves, um, how they interact with each other, and sometimes it includes blood relations, sometimes it does not, as I had kind of indicated with some of the folks that I grew up with back in the day. And then the primary role is for the family is to meet basic human needs and to launch our offspring. So when you bring those little cute folks home from the hospital, you're on the journey to get them ready to live independently, and that happens over the course of time. So really just wanting people to understand family and what it means and what the research says that we are all about. And so that's all families. So I thought I would take this opportunity to kind of share with you my family. So good looking bunch too, I might add. But these are the people who in my home. All right. And so sitting right behind me is my sister-in-law who has lived with us for a couple of decades at this point in time now. In the red shirt is my oldest son. In the green shirt is my middle son. The kid with the thumbs up is the youngest son. And then on the other side, I have in blue my baby girl, my little princess, and sitting next to her, my wife, Linda. So now, oftentimes we see pictures and want just to kind of recognize that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so I wanted to be deliberate in terms of sharing this piece with you all because I wanted you all to see something as well in terms of families and how they operate and what happens for them in terms of that. So when you look at this picture closely, you will see that there are family members and all of us have roles. There are certain things that uh, children are required to do growing up in our household. My wife and I, we become the subsystem of the parental subsystem. So our responsibility is to make sure basic needs are met for our kids, that we give them guidance around morals and ethics, that we teach them how to exist in this particular world. We also have subsystems based on gender and interest. So my boys create a unique subsystem of their own in terms of how they show up, what kind of things are important to them. So they have a unique relationship with each other based on the fact that they're just males. My daughter and I have a unique relationship based on the fact that she is a female. And so there's a different bond that I have with her than I have with my boys. Her and her mom have a bond, so they become a subset in terms of how they connect with each other. And then we're also providing care for my sister-in-law who is developmentally and intellectually incapacitated. And so this is the family system that I have, right? So when we start to think about the introduction of child welfare, um, think about these things. So we have these systems, we have these rules, we have these people who are engaged with each other, who are looking out for each other's well-being, but there might be other things that might be happening for them. So, for example, if I had one of my boys who decided to engage in illicit chemical use and their behavior and their functioning as a part of the family is diminished, it has an impact on the entire family, right? If I have another child who has some persistent mental health concerns and issues, That impacts how they behave. It impacts the working relationship that happen within those particular, in terms of that family. And so we need to be mindful of those things as well too. Providing ongoing care and everybody's role in terms of preparing to take care of an intellectually delayed adult. And then we also have this other notion, which is where child welfare comes in. So let's just say, for the sake of observation, what happens? So let's create a scenario where this young lady in the blue goes to school. She has a mark on her arm. Um, Child protection becomes involved. They determine that abuse has happened and we need to remove this child from the home. So when we remove her from the home, it has a ripple effect in terms of how it impacts the systems. So we've got people who are afraid about what has happened to their sister. We have uh, doubts about whether they will actually even return or what things will be like when they do return. So there are any number of different things that the removal of a child can have for how a family starts to operate. So if we removed any of these particular individuals out of this particular family system, it changes the dynamic, and it usually does it in a way that's pretty traumatic. So I wanted to share that piece with you to think about, the families that you are working with and what happens when we introduce those concepts or those mitigating factors that create complications in terms of how people adhere to their roles, and what happens when those families are separated by larger systems like the child welfare system. So again, thinking through those things is going to be very important. When we think about families, just kind of in general, we need to also recognize the fact that there are family conflicts. So, irregardless to the composition of the family that you have, there are these different aspects that we need to be mindful of. So, as a person coming in and working with a family, pay attention to these sources of potential family conflict because they can be important in how we resolve issues when we partner with the families. We also need to recognize that I alluded to a little bit in the previous conversation was the fact that we have problems that exist within families, right? Everybody's family's got some degree of all of these things that are happening at some particular point in time. So, as a worker working with a family, it's important to really assess and understand what those particular types of problems are. How are these things that are maybe listed here that might actually be contributing to the fact that a kid is in a home and is not safe? So we just need to always be mindful of those particular things as well too. Switching gears, I wanted to talk about another important dynamic that seems to be problematic in terms of child welfare systems around the country, and that is around engaging fathers. And so this particular segment really talks about how fathers were disengaged and disincentivized to be parents in in the child welfare system especially. So when we go back historically and we take a look at the 18 and 1900s, and we had the American slave trade, we had the genocide of Native American people, boarding school movements, we actually ended up with a loss of language, a loss of traditional teaching from the parenting role. So let me break it even plainer for you. So if I'm an African American product, or should I say slave, then there's a high likelihood that in hard economic times, my master might sell me and separate me from my wife and my children. So, with that reality being there and ever present for people in the times of slavery, how do you think that impacted the dad's ability to actually have a healthy attachment with his kid, knowing that he might be sold or they might be sold? We also have the other dynamic of when the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, then people who continued to own slaves had to actually then grow their own supply, for lack of a better term. So oftentimes, um, African American men were rented out to go to other plantations with the express purpose of impregnating other female slaves. So again, we have situations where people may have fathered 20, 30, 40 kids and have no actual relationship with them, and it was legally okay for that to happen. So just to think about how this whole thing started. And then when we start to think about moving fast forward to the 50s and 60s, when we're looking at welfare reform and how if you're already a part of a system and you're a man and you're unable to find jobs and you're being discriminated against, um, that we still have a family that we need to take care of. And so welfare rules were written in such a way that there was a no man in the house rule. And so then dads were further exacerbated and removed from those particular families. The beat goes on, unfortunately. So back in the 1980s, we had this criminal justice sentencing reform piece, and then we had this war on drugs. And so crack cocaine became the big piece of the day, and people were disproportionately locked up for having these particular substances on them. So again, another way that dads are separated from families through the criminal justice system, right? And then as we move into the 90s, we need to also understand that when we start to look at anti-poverty policies and criminal justice policies, um, there was this push to really look at engaging fathers in a way that sometimes was looked at as being punitive in terms of your fathered this child, you need to pay the child support. And I'm not arguing against that particular piece, but it created a dynamic that increased the likelihood that African American fathers would not be as involved as they could be with their particular. So again, when we think about those kind of things and we think about the impact of the criminal justice system or the education system in itself that doesn't adequately prepare, we also recognize that these anti-poverty policies did not understand the role and the significance of the role that fathers should actually play. So done some more research, and we really need to be looking at actively engaging those dads. And so, if you're a worker working with a family, one of the first meetings that you have needs to really look at looking at identifying who their dad, especially if they are not in the home. Um, there's a whole nother set of family that exists that could be a resource when we start to think about ongoing child protection intervention, reunification, and things of that particular nature. So here's what the research is saying as it relates to what happens when we do have fathers involved. We also need to prioritize having fathers being involved as well too. Again, and so here are some of the attributes. Here are some of the positive pieces that could be um, a reality for many families if we made the effort to reach out and to actually include those particular fathers. These are the good things that come about as a result of that. Um, so recognizing that fathers are important is an important process for you all to understand. And so I would encourage you to always find those fathers. Basically, in this particular state in which I live, if you're not married at the time that your children are conceived, as a dad, you have very few rights in terms of that. And so, really wanting to level the playing field. And I also believe that many of the services that child welfare utilize are oriented towards providing services for mothers and not for dads. So, we've got some work to do as it relates to that in terms of moving forward in terms of our work with dads. So, changing gears for just a second, I want to talk about an important developmental concept. And that is simply this, that in addition to the normal developmental milestones that children have to experience as they move to adulthood in the African American community, we are saddled with this additional responsibility of really starting to inform and teach our children that they're going to be targeted because of their race. It's going to happen, and if we don't have those conversations with children in a timely manner, and it gets to be tricky because how young is too young to have that conversation? How old is too old to have that conversation? When we know that at some point in time, they are going to experience racism full blown, and getting them to do that. So, what happens when we don't teach kids to understand that they're going to be targeted? Then these are some of the outcomes that they actually end up experiencing. They get caught off guard. It messes with their sense of self in terms of their identity, and sometimes that oppression plays out through self hate. So again, most people in society don't have to worry about having these types of dialogues with their kids, But if you're African American, it is absolutely essential for that to actually be a part of the dynamic, because otherwise we set kids up to be victimized and they will fail. We look at views and assumptions of racial oppression. You need to understand that how an African American person sees the world won't necessarily be how everyone else sees it. We also need to understand that every single African American family will experience oppression due to the color of their skin. It's just in the reality of the world in which we live. Racial oppression will impact how African American families are socialized, and we're often socialized to a survival orientation. So, thinking about those particular pieces is very critical for you as a worker that's going in and having conversation with these particular family members, and recognizing that everybody won't see the world the same, and kind of taking ownership of that as well too. So, given all the things that we've just talked about, um, what are some things that you can actually do when you're working with African American families? I'm glad you asked. So I'm going to talk about the next couple of slides and really kind of dig into how you can be more effective and how you can do less harm when you're intervening with Black and or African American families. First of all, here's a quote that I swear by. And so I'll give you a little bit just to kind of take a look at that whole piece. Part of the issue that we encounter is that we have people who are engaging with families who don't have a real clear understanding of their own cultural framework. And so when you're not even sure about where it is you come from or why you do the things you do or believe and have the values that you do, it becomes a potential for conflict. And so we have to just be mindful of that particular piece. And so one of the suggestions that I have is to do some work in terms of really doing some exploration in terms of what your culture is. Everybody has one, everyone comes from one, but we don't often pay close attention to that. It's going to be essential for you to do quality work with families who don't look like you. So, some practical pieces. Um, you've got to build a trusting relationship. So, be honest with people about what your involvement with them is like and how it can play itself out. Do those things. Speaking to clients about your experience in that relationship building piece while you're doing the assessment can be more effective than the facts. Um, Always understand and accept that race is always a factor. It's never not on the table. Whether we speak to it or not, it actually is. Be non defensive. We would also recommend that you look at completing an IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory Assessment, and follow up with an IDP. This is a psychometric tool that actually measures people's ability to work across cultures with some different things that you can also do to enhance that process. Um, so when we continue to apply the knowledge here, uh, let's not do the false perception of equality. We're not equal when we show up at the house, and we won't be. Recognize that this particular interaction is going to be different. Don't go on a guilt trip. Um, Make sure that you do some research and studying of your own in addition to your own cultural upbringing, but also what are some of the impacts and the effects of oppression. Check your bias. The two questions that I have underneath here are really important and were really instrumental for me in my career by looking at it through the trauma informed lens. So, whenever I saw behavior that I did not understand, my first thought was, rather than to have an attitude about that or a bias about that piece, is to really ask myself, what happened to that individual? What happened to that particular family that causes them to be able to behave in this manner? It's a different way of looking at it. The other part of that question would be also is like, what did that family or a member of that family not receive when they needed it? Was it nurturing? Were they victims of abject poverty? Were they not nurtured? What kind of things make it possible for people to behave the way they do? This is very instrumental and very key in terms of really being in a place where you're checking your biases by reframing your thought process in terms of trying to understand the behavior that you're experiencing. It reminds me of a case that I had many, many, many years ago as a child welfare worker, where I had a young mom who had an 18-month-old child, and she took this child to a party in a different city, um, using chemicals, doing all kinds of things, and she left this child in the care of people who she had just met at this particular party, and she just never came back to get this kid. So we became involved because of the child abandonment piece. And so I remember the year and a half of work that I did with this particular family, and I always harped on these particular questions, and I wanted to try to get to the root of what was happening, to ask, so what happened to you that makes it okay for you to leave a 18-month-old child in the care of strangers? Something happened, and if we don't get to the root of it, um, we won't. What kind of things did you not receive that made it okay for you to be involved in that kind of behavior that put your kid at risk? Um, to this day, as I remember working with this particular individual, I never got the answers to those questions. She ended up voluntarily terminating her rights, getting pregnant, and marrying someone else. So it just made me think about all of those particular things. So for you as workers, make sure that you're always looking through that trauma informed lens. It's vitally important. At the naturally occurring strengths, we've already talked about the whole concept of how interdependence works and how families are involved. So please involve families as soon as you possibly can. Locate and involve those fathers. Find the extended family members. Embrace complexity. Use culturally specific service providers. There is also an assignment that I used to have my seniors take when they took my class called Understanding Systems of Privilege and Oppression, called the Ethnic Introduction. It's an assignment that you all can have access to by going to my YouTube channel, and it gives you the ability to look at creating a genogram of your own family, going back and having some conversations with people in your family about what things were like when they migrated to this particular country. Was it forced? Was it escaping political oppression? What was it? And then what kind of things did your family experience in terms of advantages or disadvantages based on where they came from in the world? Very powerful exercise that I would encourage you all to take that journey as it relates to really helping understand your own culture better. So, moving along, when we think about the family assessment, we need to be looking at all of these things. We need to be looking at the family resources, friends, families, organizations, how they show up in the community. We also need to be able to look at assessing that communication piece. So sometimes we'll have things that are very verbal and very not verbal, but really try to understand the context of when you see those things, to maybe ask questions about what that's about, because that might be just how that family communicates and connects with each other. Also recognizing that when you enter into a family that you're working with, families are in different cycles of adjustment life cycles. So these are typically the cycles that people have, and you may inherit a case with people being in any of these particular stages. So be mindful of the stages that people are in and some of the naturally occurring issues that come about as a result of that. We're just moving into an assessment or engaging in planning. We want to minimize um, that early apprehension. We want to ask the family members to explain what their concerns are, come up with an agreement, commit to a plan of action, reinforce the positive strengths that are there and the qualities that are in that particular family. Pay attention to how people connect with each other as well. We also need to be looking at identifying those strengths. So all of the things here that we see on the screen are things that you as a social worker or as a person working with this family need to be able to establish enough of a relationship to really start to identify what some of these identification pieces actually are, because they're going to be very important um, to that particular process. We also want you to think about looking at assessing across those domains. So paying attention to basic needs, housing, kinship, care, spirituality, violence in the home, mental health concerns, day-to-day parenting abilities, substance abuse, medical, as well as child well-being. And so when you're working with those families, if you can assess in these particular areas, because we want to recognize that the fact that it came into child protection because the child was hurt or put in an unsafe situation is really a symptom of something that's larger that's often happening within inside of this family. And a thorough investigation of these pieces will maybe actually lead you to how that particular piece plays itself out and what might work in terms of the ongoing work for that particular family. And then finally, I want to just share this piece with you as well too, as we get ready to close. Um, there's a golden rule that we all know about: treat others the way you would want to be treated, and now that should be replaced by the platinum rule, which is treating people how they want to be treated. So it's an important piece for us to really understand that culture is always present, and it's to our best advantage to find out as much as we can about culture so that we don't make mistakes. So I will close this presentation with this particular story that I want to share with you all. So as I told you, I'd been a child protection worker for 18 years and started back in even the 80s. So about a year and a half ago, I was in a local grocery store. I just come from a funeral, so of a person who was very close, and so not in a really great space anyway. So going through the self-checkout lane, I hear a young man standing over across from me saying, "Excuse me." I'm thinking like, okay, he can't be talking to me because I don't work here. And so I continued to scan my items. And so he turned and he said, "Excuse me again." And so I turned and I go, "Yes." And he looked at me and he said, "Didn't you used to be a social worker?" Which for all those of us who are social workers know that this question can go any different way in terms of that. So I finally bit the bullet and said, "Yeah, I did used to be a social worker." And he said, "I thought so. I recognize you." And then he told me his name and said, "This is who I am." Walks over to me and he embraces me in the middle of this particular grocery store and he whispers in my ear, "I will never forget what you did for me and my family." It made my day in different ways because as he started to talk to me, I remember I was 8, this kid was 8, 9 years old when I met him. This is almost 30 years later, and he still remembered the impact of me working with his family in a way. He's doing well now. He introduced me to his girlfriend, mom, and the siblings are all doing well. Um, but you just never know. And so I share that with you to say that you do have the capacity and often will make a difference in the lives of your families. So be curious, be kind, because kindness costs you nothing. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to share with you on the next couple of screens. Here are some references that I utilized as I was putting this particular piece together. So I would want you all to do some research on your own as it relates to some of the information that's been presented here. These are other pieces of information that I utilize in terms of pulling this information together, in terms of putting this presentation together as well. And here's the last page in terms of those references. So I thank you for your time and attention during this particular presentation. I hope that there were things that you can take away from this process as you continue to work with the African American families that show up on your caseload. So I would thank you and wish you a wonderful rest of the day.